I present to you Charles Darwin, an ordinary boy who became an extraordinary scientist. It all started when Charles was just a young lad of 5 years old. His father, Robert Darwin, was a well-known doctor and surgeon in the community, and he was pretty strict. You might even say he was a bit of a meanie. On the other hand, his mother was very caring. She gave him a lot of love and attention, and she took care of him when he was sick. Sadly, she died when Darwin was only 8 years old, and from that moment on, Darwin's father became even more strict than before, forbidding him from having any fun or playing with friends. All Darwin could do was read books, which ended up making him quite introverted. When Darwin was 16, his father wanted him to become a doctor, so he sent him off to Edinburgh Medical School. At first, Darwin felt like this was his calling, but it didn't take long for him to realize that becoming a doctor meant having to dissect dead bodies, and let's just say that made him queasy. So after 2 years, he left medical school and went to Cambridge University to study to be a clergyman. However, we say he was too enthusiastic about his studies, since he spent most of his time fishing and exploring nature instead. But then something amazing happened when Darwin was 23 years old. He met a man named John Henslow, who was a professor of botany. This guy loved talking about nature, and he introduced Darwin to the idea of adapting to the environment. For example, he showed Darwin fossils of extinct marine creatures that were found high up in the mountains, and he said something along the lines of, "Hey, look at these fossils. Don't you think it's weird that they're up here?" Then he asked Darwin, "Do you think that God created these animals just to have them go extinct?" Of course, Darwin thought that was a stupid question because God wouldn't do something like that. But then Henshaw said, well, maybe the species changed over time, and that got Darwin thinking. At the time, people believed that each species was created independently by God, and that there was one single creation event for each species. For example, they believed that the world had been created around 6,000 years ago during the time of Adam and Eve. And that's why people called it the Genesis flood, because it was described in the book of Genesis in the Bible. Henslow wasn't the only one who suggested that species change over time. There were also other scientists who proposed theories similar to Henslow, but they didn't come up with these ideas because of scientific evidence. Instead, they came up with them because they didn't believe in the Genesis flood. However, they didn't have any evidence to support their theories either, and that's why most people still believed that species didn't change over time. They simply didn't have enough evidence to prove otherwise. However, everything would change when Darwin went on a trip to the Galapagos Islands and saw some weird animals that inspired him to start his own theory. In 1831, Darwin became the ship's naturalist on board the HMS Beagle. It was a 5-year journey, and he would go on to explore many different places around the world. But his favorite stop was the Galapagos Islands. It was there that he encountered several animals that seemed oddly familiar, but also different from each other. For example, he found marine iguanas, which are reptiles that hang out in the water. Then he found giant tortoises, which are reptiles that live on land. He also saw finches that looked like sparrows, and others that looked like hummingbirds. Plus, there were many other strange creatures that he couldn't identify. So when he returned home, he decided to research these animals. And what he discovered was, you see, he learned that the marine iguana was related to the giant tortoise, and that the different finches were all related to each other. But why did they all look different? Well, when Darwin dug deeper into the subject, he realized that there are many different species of giant tortoises and marine iguanas living in the Galapagos Islands, and they all have slightly different traits. For example, some giant tortoises have saddle-shaped shells, while others have dome-shaped shells. And some marine iguanas have longer snouts, while others have shorter snouts. It was then that Darwin realized that these animals didn't just appear out of nowhere. Instead, they must have descended from ancestors that were common to both the tortoises and the marine iguana. Over millions of years, these ancestors changed into the different species that we see today. And that's how Darwin came up with his theory of evolution. Let's jump back to the year 1837, when Darwin was doing his research. At first, he wrote down a bunch of notes about his observations and thoughts in a notebook, but eventually, he decided to write a bigger book titled The Voyage of the Beagle, which detailed his discoveries in the Galapagos Islands. After finishing the book, he shared some of his findings with his friends, and they gave him some good feedback. One friend even told him, "Hey, you should write a whole book on this topic." So Darwin went back to his notes and started working on the most important book in history. Now, let's talk about why Darwin didn't publish his book right away. You see, he knew that his theory would upset a lot of people, especially religious folks. And even though he was a clergyman himself, he didn't want to upset his colleagues. So he kept working on his book while keeping a low profile. But then something happened. In 1858, another scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace sent Darwin an essay with almost the exact same ideas as Darwin's theory. It was then that Darwin realized he couldn't wait any longer to publish his book. If he waited, someone else might get the credit for discovering the theory of evolution. In 1859, Darwin finally published his book, which he called On the Origin of Species. It was an instant hit. People couldn't stop talking about it. Some people were excited because they had never thought of such a fascinating idea. Others were scared because it contradicted their beliefs. And yet others were angry because they thought it was ridiculous. But you know what? Despite all the craziness, Darwin became famous overnight. People wanted to meet him and learn more about his ideas. So Darwin toured around the country, giving lectures and answering questions, and to this day, his work continues to inspire scientists and shape our understanding of the natural world. Later years, after publishing his book, Darwin continued to work on other projects. He studied the behavior of animals and plants, and wrote several more books. He also had a big impact on other scientists and helped to establish evolutionary biology as a field of study. Unfortunately, Darwin didn't receive many awards or honors during his lifetime. He was offered a knighthood, but he turned it down because he didn't want to be a sir. However, in 1882, he became the first foreign member of the Italian Academy of Sciences. And when he died in 1882, he was buried in Westminster Abbey next to Sir Isaac Newton. It was a fitting tribute to one of the greatest scientists of all time. Darwin's legacy has had a profound impact on our world. His ideas have revolutionized the way we understand the natural world and continue to inspire scientists and thinkers today. Darwin's work has also sparked debate and controversy, but it has ultimately led to a deeper understanding of our place in the universe. His ideas continue to shape our world in ways that we are only beginning to understand. As you can see, Charles Darwin didn't have an easy life. He faced many obstacles and challenges, but he never gave up on his curiosity about the natural world. In fact, he was willing to go against the entire scientific community to prove his theory correct. That's why he's considered one of the greatest scientists of all time. Even though he didn't have much going for him, he turned his life around and accomplished something that no one else could have done. And if you want to learn more about incredible people who changed the world, don't forget to subscribe.